The reason that we promote the protected network here is we don't think that we will be able to reduce carbon emissions fast enough on the path we're on. We need to shift 20 to 25% of intra-city trips to very low emission modes. So it makes sense that the places that are already climate aware are out ahead of us in the world. What is really tragic to see is when other countries are copying the United States transportation system because they're just importing all of our problems. So I think we have a moral obligation to create safe networks for these modes that also provide equity and affordable living, and they can reduce the family's transportation expenses by budget by $5,000 to $6,000 a year. That's a pay raise.
This time on the Plutopia News Network, we talk about transportation, not light rail or more freeways, not Uber, Lyft, or high-speed transit. John and Scoop talked about tiny transit with Susan Engelking, mobility disruptor and author of Tiny Transit for Cities. Cut carbon emissions in your city before it's too late.
This is the Plutopia News Network. You can find us on Twitter as @Plutopia and on Facebook as Plutopia News Network. We feature interviews and news from the fringes via conversations with interesting people about compelling ideas. Today's guest is Susan Engelking, founder and executive director of the nonprofit Institute for Community Mobility, where the focus is on creating a new mobility infrastructure designed around people, not cars. Susan is a consultant and advocate for micromobility with a background in economic development. She's the author of Tiny Transit, Cut Carbon Emissions in Your City Before It's Too Late, which is a friendly how-to guide for cities and climate activists. So welcome, Susan.
Happy to have you. Thank you for having me.
You're executive director of the Institute for Community MicroMobility. Could you define micromobility for us?
Yes. When we use the term micromobility, we're referring to all modes that do not exceed 25 miles per hour. So that would include, neighborhood electric vehicles, scooters, seated or standing, pedicabs, and then we also include all of the active modes and kind of hybrid modes like pedal assist pedicabs, pedal assist bikes. So it's about providing a safe, protected infrastructure for all of the modes under 25 miles per hour.
Well, you do mention safety there, and I know, especially like with scooters downtown, for instance, there's been a lot of concern about safety on those kinds of vehicles. How do you address that?
I believe, to begin with, that scooters are going to evolve very quickly to become much safer. When the scooter companies dropped them all across America one week a couple of years ago, I don't know that they had invested enough in them that if it just hadn't worked out, they would be gone. But it did, and now there's a real realization that we need safer, better kind of modes. So I'm in touch with some of the scooter makers as we talk about this, like the director of safety of Bird, and on the things we can do to help protect all of these modes. And of course, we don't want them out on sidewalks tripping people either.
Yeah, I've actually had that experience, and it was quite a fall. It seemed to me that scooters sort of appeared out of nowhere. Just suddenly there were so many of them in our environment. Am I correct in assuming that there was not much thought about the general safety of people using those scooters before they started dropping them into cities?
I think you're right. There was just the thought of let's put them out there and do it so fast that cities don't have time to react and people fall in love with them and start using them in a volume, which has occurred, that is so huge that they can't be taken back. They're out of the bottle. The genie's out of the bottle. So yeah, there was not a lot of thought, I think, put into what it would look like a year later.
A number of environmental groups have concerns about the batteries used in all of these electric vehicles. Do you see this as a serious problem and something that can be solved?
I see it as a serious problem. However, when you're talking micromobility, you're talking a fraction of the power usage. So, for example, a neighborhood electric vehicle in the course of a year might use as much energy as a refrigerator. So I think we need new and better approaches to batteries, but some of these use so little energy and fuel and have so little carbon emissions that we just intuitively know they make sense. I mean, people don't realize the average car out there emits 4.6 metric tons of carbon a year. So we're talking about tiny fractions of that, and then improving those very small batteries.
Don't the batteries tend to be rechargeable and recyclable?
Oh yes. Oh, yes, they're rechargeable. And there's some really interesting work going on with solar powered neighborhood electric vehicles as well. So in the best of worlds, that will evolve and get better very quickly.
A lot of the concern from the environmental groups was just the sourcing of the elements of lithium-ion battery. Some of them come from countries that exploit the labor, and so there are a lot of concerns. So do you see any light ahead for an alternative to the lithium-ion battery? You mentioned solar. Is there anything else on the horizon?
I don't know for certain, but I've had some very interesting conversations with Paul Robbins, who is the founder of the Austin Environmental Directory. And, I think everyone's waiting and looking for something better. But I want to mention, they say a Tesla or a Leaf, you can feel very good about driving an electric car. They use a lot of energy and they have very large batteries. So to the extent possible, if we can just do a pedal assist mode or a small lightweight neighborhood electric vehicle that uses almost nothing and can recharge at a 110 outlet, then we're really talking orders of magnitude smaller to deal with.
I think that you had mentioned that there are some cities that have already been sort of reconsidering or redeveloping their infrastructure around micromobility. Is that correct?
Oh, yes. They go from coast to coast right now. From Peachtree City, Georgia, which kind of stumbled into this by kids using golf carts to get to high school. And instead of banning this, the city of Peachtree, Georgia decided to embrace it and watch it and observe it. And so they have gone and created, I think, a fascinating model for how to build a protected infrastructure. They recently had a $10 million in, I believe, bond expenditure that built 26 miles of off-road protected paths. And you just compare that to what $10 million buys in conventional transportation. And, it's vastly different. So you can build this for very little money. Lincoln, California, not Nevada, Lincoln, California is another place. They've had a neighborhood electric vehicle plan in place for over 10 years. They're way out there and people come from all over the country to go see what they're doing. Los Angeles is trying to plot a path. Coachella Valley just built 2 miles of a 50-mile network that will link together 3 tribes and a number of cities with a low-speed path running parallel to the high-speed highway.
Parallel to, but not on, right?
But not on.
That's an interesting point because, you have the huge safety issues with bicycle lanes that are set up actually on the street, sort of off to the right. You take your life in your hands when you're riding in a bicycle lane, and the bicycle lanes are discontinuous sometimes.
I think we have allowed bicycle infrastructure just to be tacked on to conventional infrastructure, and it's wrong. We need a completely separate, protected infrastructure that isn't designed around the geometry of cars. So I argue strongly that safety is the prime directive for all new infrastructure, and that's why it needs to be protected. I mean, you're exactly right. I don't feel safe riding a bicycle on the streets of Austin. Why would we want to put more modes out there unless we can figure this out with a protected infrastructure, which is not very expensive to build and can be done very quickly.
Do you see the infrastructure being a totally new, something totally separate from the existing roads in the urban areas, so which might be a problem just because of the way the cities are already built out and the real estate is pretty limited?
Yeah. What we have done, for example, with Austin, and I mentioned when I say we, I worked with a PhD civil engineer with a master's in urban planning, and we collaborate together. Her name is Katie Cam. And we identified 15 locations just in Austin that really lend themselves to a demonstration project. You asked if it could be part of the infrastructure. In some cases, like take Airport Boulevard, that takes people to Austin Community College Highland campus. If you look at that street, it has an enormous amount of unused capacity. We could take that, use very quick to act concrete barriers and water and air-filled barriers that are in graveyards all across the United States. They cost virtually almost nothing, and cordon off a portion of that street so that we could allow people to get from east of the interstate all the way to Austin Community College campus and do a demonstration there. In other cases, you want an off-road path where that works. So what's different about this is instead of having a transportation department, having a really limited range of tools, we've got roads, we've got bridges, we've got highways. We look at where people are going and where they're coming from and find logical paths that are as protected as possible using things like barricades and bollards, retractable bollards. In fact, we just did some work with Community First Village, for the formerly homeless and disabled, and they're now using pedicabs all around the village and neighborhood electric vehicles. And I wouldn't be surprised if pretty soon they're not driving cars at all on that campus. I want to mention too, City of Kyle is very interested in moving forward with a micromobility plan that would make their city one of the most livable cities in the country. They want to really change their course. What you describe is once the environment's built, it's a lot harder to go back in there and build out infrastructure. But if you're growing like Austin is or like Kyle is, it's much easier to do this. And once there are demonstration projects, it just becomes contagious. Everybody then wants it. It's me next.
You had mentioned cities within the U.S. that are already starting to consider and to actually work on changing their infrastructures. And I was wondering if there are models outside the U.S. that we should be looking to that have been very effective.
Well, what we do see is not so much protected paths, but a change in how bicycles are treated as, legitimate modes in Europe and Copenhagen and Amsterdam and places where it's perfectly normal for people to get on their bike and ride to work, and a little more exceptional to get in a car. The reason that we promote the protected network here is we don't think that we will be able to reduce carbon emissions fast enough on the path we're on. We need to shift 20 to 25% of intra-city trips to very low emission modes. So it makes sense that the places that are already climate aware are out ahead of us in the world. What is really tragic to see is when other countries are copying the United States transportation system because they're just importing all of our problems. So I think we have a moral obligation to create safe networks for these modes that also provide equity and affordable living, and they can reduce the family's transportation expenses by budget by $5,000 to $6,000 a year. That's a pay raise.
In your vision of micromobility, do you see a role also for what you might say macro for buses and rail and that sort of thing?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think what's interesting is these modes work for, short distances. You wouldn't want to drive a neighborhood electric vehicle from Austin to San Antonio. It would take you hours. But ideally, these become the first and last mile connection to public transit. And they also do something that transit can't do. There are some routes where there's just not enough ridership to justify them, but you can justify a pool in a neighborhood electric vehicle. So we talked to a couple of cities about that as well. Public transit becomes all the more important.
In my own neighborhood, I noticed there are some people who have golf carts here. We see them tooling around occasionally on the streets. I think there's at least a couple of golf carts out here. And, we worry about them like getting kind of steamrolled, but they actually seem to fit in pretty well and be pretty safe. And of course, if you visit, say, Port Aransas, you've got people on all kinds of smaller vehicles. They have like dune buggy kind of vehicles down there and golf carts and so forth. And people are running around on those, and you accommodate to them pretty well. I mean, the automobile traffic, the people who are driving the cars come to understand that these other vehicles are sharing the road with them, and they accommodate.
Yeah, I think we're at a very exciting time, and it's really the people's transportation when we talk about these modes, because they're so low cost. I was just yesterday in Dallas meeting with their transportation department, and they want to incorporate this into some of their strategic plans. But what I noticed is Dallas I saw at least 3 kinds of vehicles, small modes, that I'd never seen before. I mean, people are getting very creative with this. And I mean, just being in Austin, I've gotten to know 2 of the companies that are making businesses out of this. One is Movement Pedicab. It's a pedicab manufacturer right here in Austin and fleet operator. Electric Cab North America is based here in Austin. And it just gets more and more interesting.
Are there neighborhoods here in Austin where neighborhood electric vehicles are starting to appear and be used?
What we're seeing, like in Rollingwood, they made it legal to drive golf carts around. We don't advocate golf carts because they're not really that safe. They tip over, people fall out, but they're much cheaper, and so people tend to adopt them first. So Rollingwood has made it legal to drive golf carts around. Once people get used to this kind of rethinking about the geometry of transportation, then the next vehicle they buy might very well be an NEV, and it really should be. Like in Lincoln, California, they are taking all the people, it started with golf carts. They talk to all the people with golf carts and say, when you replace it with a neighborhood electric vehicle, because a golf cart is not even street legal. So that's what's happening.
So NEVs are street legal?
Yes, up to 45 miles per hour on streets up to 45 miles per hour.
Okay.
In Texas. In other states, it's up to 35 miles per hour and so on, whereas a golf cart is not. Because neighborhood electric vehicles, if you have never been in one, they're just delightful. They're so compact, and yet I'm kind of tall. They're much roomier for tall people. They have high ceilings, low step in, work great for the elderly. In fact, we went and interviewed people who are low-income seniors at the Rebecca Baines Johnson Center. And when we showed them what was possible, the excitement in that room was just crazy, because they're having to depend on other people or Capital Metro access for rides. And they could literally drive these themselves on protected paths.
I'm looking at the Wikipedia page for neighborhood electric vehicles, and it looks like there are a number of manufacturers and a lot of diversity in that particular field. And before I talked to you, I hadn't really heard of any of these. And I haven't seen any in the streets that I know of here.
it's not easy to even be able to go get one because the neighborhood electric vehicle manufacturers, and probably the leading one in the United States, is Polaris, the one who makes also a lot of snowmobiles and sports craft, Polaris Gym. And their selling is to institutions like colleges, malls, corporate campuses. So a lot of people have never seen one. In Austin, if you wanted to test it out, you can go to Rainy Street any night and jump on a neighborhood electric vehicle cab.
Ah, interesting.
Yeah. In fact, the largest fleet of neighborhood electric vehicle taxis is right here in Austin.
How large is that fleet?
They have 150 altogether, including with a couple of other cities.
And are they mostly downtown, in the downtown area?
They mostly operate those in downtown. I think they're also in St. Louis and another couple of locations they're expanding. But they work great for downtown. In fact, the Downtown Austin Alliance, the Movability Austin, are both with us on this. And so we need to familiarize ourselves very quickly with them. I did a demo in Dallas with the director of transportation a couple of years ago, and we did it at Dallas City Hall on a very cold, rainy day. So we thought no one would come for our 2-hour demo. We had so many people on them, and they just break out in smiles when they realize this is all you need to get around short distances, short being less than 10 miles.
You know, we sort of famously talk about our congestion and transportation issues here in Austin, but I've been traveling a bit, and everywhere I go, I'm seeing it. You know, any city that has that is in any way interesting, you know, where people show up, the streets are just completely bollocksed, you know. Yeah,
we have really boxed ourselves in a corner as a country by our dependence on this and the refusal of a kind of a calcified system to welcome a different geometry. Literally, I was told by a high-ranking transportation person, Susan, you cannot change the geometry of transportation. But of course you can. We're doing it. What we owe these people on these low emission modes and active modes, bicycles, is safe passage. They're people too. Let me just tell you a horrible statistic that it's just an idea of how dangerous the roads are for these kinds of modes if they're not protected. I was talking with the director of transportation in Dallas when we met yesterday, and I learned that there have been 22 pedestrian deaths in Dallas since January 1. We haven't even finished February. It's a crisis. And interestingly, congestion makes it a little bit easier because when you're driving in a congested area, you're going very slow. You know, we've all done that on Mopac or IH-35. So if you do hit a pedestrian, they're less likely to be killed. And so here's a piece of data. I'm a bit of a data person. But if you're a pedestrian and you're hit by a vehicle going 45 miles per hour, there's a 95% chance you will be killed. But if that vehicle is going 25 miles per hour, there's a 5% chance you will be killed. And then it gets better than that because low-speed vehicles have more perspective, so they simply have less possibility for crashes. So we've got to do something. And you're right, this pedestrian deaths, bicycle deaths across the country are soaring. Why would we add another mode to these unprotected modes on our streets?
It seems that a lot of the problem with the transportation nightmare that has been created in all the urban areas is due to the influence of the oil and gas companies, which have way more political clout than any of the environmental groups like you.
Yeah, you really touch a wonderful point there. I have to recommend a report that I've read in the last couple of months, and I've reread it. It's called Rethink X, like RETHINK and then capital X, their transportation report. And what they describe is a world that changes and the oil markets collapse, and a change that happens so quickly. It's like a tipping point with Malcolm Gladwell's point. And if we aren't careful, we'll be out there building an infrastructure that will be out of date before it comes online. So we've got to rethink this, and we've got to stand up to the lobbies that sabotage progress.
Yeah, the oil and gas industry and the automotive industry that runs on fossil fuels was responsible for actually killing a lot of great early electric transit systems around the country. The Bay Area, yes. The San Francisco area was key, also Los Angeles, because they had great electric trolleys. And suddenly General Motors and the oil companies comes in and said, oh, no, you have to have buses that run on oil and gas.
Yeah, there's no overstating what they've done and how it has hurt our country. I worry so much about the next recession. I'm old enough to have lived through a recession. And most people, a lot of young adults are not that old. But if we do not change this now while we can and make it possible to live in a city like Austin or any city, and to be able to get to a job and get back or get groceries or get a kid to school without having to get into an internal combustion engine or a high power usage electric conventional size vehicle, when that person or that parent or that family loses a job and they're still laid off and they're still tied to a $400 a month car payment with a car that's total annual cost, according to the American Automobile Association, is $8,600 on average. You can't sustain that when you've been laid off. And people can become desperate, angry, stuck, suicidal, and really angry. We owe people getting this right while we still have a strong economy. And frankly, we owe the world a model for how to cut carbon emissions very quickly and very inexpensively.
I've heard that millennials are less inclined to buy automobiles now.
Yes. It's so funny how so many people now in their teens, 20s, really would like to get along and get around without having to own a car, because they've seen how to do this with scooters and with bicycles and transit and Uber and Lyft and all the ride share services. You don't have to have a car anymore. And if you read that Rethink X report, it predicts that the average family's expenditure on transportation will be cut by $5,000 a year just by making this shift.
Yeah, I see that they say that there's going to be a major disruption. Is the disruption because of the evolution of alternatives, or is it because of like peak oil? Or
I think the disruption is out of the technology largely. And the oil industry will find fewer buyers over time for their product. And then what they argue, and I believe this is right, is that in the end, as much as people say they want to own their own car, if they really don't need it anymore, and if they can really cancel that insurance policy or bring it down to a $200 a year policy for neighborhood electric vehicles, in the end, they're going to be cost sensitive. Like, here's an example, maybe not everyone will remember, but it's interesting that everyone used to pump their own gasoline. And people said, oh, no woman will get out of with her dress and her hat and pump her own gasoline. And sure, there were some people who hung on to those full service places for a while, but people changed because it was cheaper.
I've noticed that there are a lot of parking spots that are set up specifically for electric cars. I suppose we'll see an increase in those.
Yeah, I think we will. And it's an important change. I also would would hope that people would begin to become familiar with neighborhood electric vehicles. The idea being to stage several demonstrations in cities that are interested. I mean, I wrote a book called Tiny Transit: Cut Carbon Emissions in Your City Before It's Too Late. And the reason I wrote that was as a line in the water to see what I could catch, what cities out there are interested. And we've caught a couple. And they want to rethink how their cities are designed. I mean, Kyle is a great example. They could create a low-speed downtown and then create a downtown.
The problem with new infrastructure, especially I've seen in Austin, seems to be the not in my neighborhood syndrome, because a lot of people, no matter how great the change is, they don't want it in their neighborhood. They want to send it over somewhere else. Do you think that's going to be a problem with the networks?
I think it is a problem, and it's a problem everywhere. But there's a new movement that's starting to take that on, and it's not the mobility movement so much, but in combination, a housing movement where it's actually out of San Francisco. A woman whose last name is Trauss, Trauss, was written up in the New York Times recently because she's actually an advocate for allowing denser housing in places where it was previously not thought to be good by the neighbors. And her point is, how do we expect housing prices to come down when we're not producing housing that people can afford? And I think micromobility is right squarely in that. Like, for example, there's a development here in Austin that the neighborhood fought and pretty much killed, and I understand. But that development, they didn't kill it. It became an upper class development. It's being built right now, and there is no type of housing that is going to serve average people. That developer was interested in including this network in their plans. The neighborhood didn't even want to talk to them at all, so plans never got discussed. What we would like to see is all new plans on the drawing board in Austin, in every city in the United States. Look at how can we incorporate this infrastructure with the developer or the company that's building it paying for the infrastructure. And in fact, they can reduce their development costs because this infrastructure, say it accounts for 20 to 30% of cars or trips, that's that much less parking lot. And new housing is not going to need 2-car garages in the way that it's hard to imagine, but we aren't going to need that anymore pretty soon. And that's going to be a stranded investment.
Are you thinking about that cities should make this a requirement, like green space requirements?
Well, I think the city should, yes, but it has to be done right. And nobody's quite there yet. And it should be done by the city. They're building design the South Central waterfront, which is an area south of Austin and adjacent to Lady Bird Lake. As recently as, or as far back as almost 3 years ago, I met trying to suggest that this micromobility infrastructure be incorporated in that development. It's a planned development by the city. And we were told it was too late. Well, it's 2.5 years later, and it wasn't too late. To my mind, anytime the city or a private developer goes forward, we can show them how it's not just a mandate, it's in their interest to include this because it'll have greater appeal to their employees. And people want to work for a climate conscious company, and it costs less, and they don't need to have a car.
I was wondering, since your book mentions cutting carbon emissions, whether you have actual statistics about the potential impact on climate change.
Not so much on climate change, but what we can say is
or emissions or carbon.
Oh, emissions. Definitely. So say an average car, the average car emits 4.6 metric tons of carbon emissions every year. What we have done is, and I'm happy to share with your listeners, we took a look at this and came up with kind of what I call the transportation trifecta. Build this micromobility infrastructure with crumbs, By the way, we call it lean mobility, for low emission alternative network, lean mobility. And if you do that, and if you look at all the new projects that are coming down and being planned and designed, and if you look at taking, say, large road bond issues and say spend 3%, just 3% of that on incorporating a protected network, here's what can happen. I did a pro forma for Austin, and what it shows is in year one, we could have $100 million value network for micromobility and start cutting carbon emissions such that by the year 2026, we will have cut 500,000 metric tons of carbon that would have gone into our air from Austin, and we can just eliminate it. So I'm in touch with this group called the Climate Center out of California, and what they think about is we need 20 movements like this, at least, where we're going in and tackling point sources of carbon emissions and coming up with better solutions, a lot of them now enabled by technology, like how apps have changed transportation. So, the reason I wrote my book is I wanted to get it in the hands of climate activists and city leaders everywhere. And then once they're reading it, you discover the multitude of benefits of having a low cost infrastructure for mobility.
So you talk about getting your books into the hands of activists. Do you have a network of activists that you're working with?
I have a network of people who, like Catherine, that are supporting, cheering me on. There's a foundation that's interested in helping us with this next year of funding so we can get more books out there. I've got a company that may pay for 2,000 books at my no markup rate just to get them out to mayors. So, but I'm always wanting to hear from people. So I invite anyone to contact me, and I'll keep you posted about what we're doing.
In the past couple of South by Southwest festivals, mayors have come to town and held a conference or meeting during South by Southwest. It would be worthwhile to find out whether they're going to be here this year. That might be a good time to find some time with them.
That's a great idea, and thanks. that really is true. I really feel for mayors out there because they're working with a very established transportation, not just infrastructure, physical infrastructure of people, and it's really hard for people who have been trained with roads and clover leaves and all that to shift. So the mayors are typically saying things like they will have their cities net carbon neutral by the year 2050. That's way too late. It's not acceptable. I want people to go, that's not good enough.
2021, probably too late.
It's too late. It lets everyone off the hook. All the people who are on this today won't be around or will be retired and collecting their pensions, but they're not going to be suffering the consequences of our failure to act. And very soon, within the next 5 years, we will understand how right Greta Thunberg is. Everyone will, all 7 some odd billion of us will see it. And what I'm suggesting is let's take these actions right now. We can do it. We can do it fast, but it takes mobility disruptors like me and a lot of the people that I've been working with, like the movement pedicab and electric cab and the city of Dallas and the city of Kyle and Lincoln. And you get these people together. In fact, the event we're trying to pull together now is a pop-up think tank of early adopters and innovators. It would be the first ever, just with entities that are already experienced with this and proving it.
Can you say a little bit more about that? How would this think tank work when you say pop-up?
Well,
would it be like floating? Would it be from place to place, or?
Oh, good question. I think the very first one is simply a one-day event. It's creative people from I've identified 10 probable cities that also include places like Atlanta, where they're trying to integrate micromobility and just getting warmed up about it. Coming in for a one-day event, inviting in some great minds, sharing what works, and coming up with what's next. And what's next might well be forming a game plan that's a federal game plan on how to carry this forward in cities all over the country, or creating a resource bank to where we can help cities, even cities are really tightly stretched, figure out not only how can they do this, but why they can't afford not to do this. The savings are almost immediately for cities, in that people start being able to move around more easily, and not everybody needs a car, and the economic development follows that. So I would love to talk with anyone who is interested in putting on the Popup think tank. And the thought is 3 months later, we do it again. And then you ask if it rotates, it does rotate. We've got to have it once. And then from there, in fact, we've got a top 10 city that's interested in hosting it right now.
Have you had any conversations with strategic foresight professionals or working with you on this sort of thing? I mean, they tend to have methodologies that might pretty well support the process of doing one of these think tanks.
No, but I will look into that. That's a good thought.
For instance, there's the Institute for the Future partners with people on doing like futurist explorations and speculations that support new thinking about how things can be done. I mean, a disruption of transportation is it's a pretty huge change, and it's really hard to kind of figure out how you get into it. And I know I was in a meeting that the Institute for the Future had with mayors at South by Southwest one of the years that they were here, like it was a couple of years ago, I think. And those mayors they have so much that they have to concern themselves with. I mean, they have the politics of their city, and they have to kind of work at handling what is, and they're very much immersed in what is. So they don't really have much time to think in terms of cultivating a vision or thinking about what their future will be. And it's very helpful for them to be exposed to methodologies that support thinking about how things can be changed or transformed to fit the sort of evolving present as well as the future.
Yeah. Well, that's so true about mayors. There's so much on their plates. And so one of the things that we try to present is, let us make this easy for you. Let's do a demo. Your people will get it, understand it, write in them. And then some of these things can evolve with very little money, very little effort, with very little time. And so our goal is kind of accelerated. I want to mention, I do have two futurists now that you mentioned advising me. One is Pam Ryan, and she just wrote a book called Impact Imperative on the state of the future and what's needed. And so she's been greatly helpful to us. We need more. And it's really, as I've gotten into this, at first I thought, well, this is so obvious. Anyone can see that we need to do this. But over time, I began to realize this is such a paradigm change. It's not easy to adopt until you have that moment where it clicks for you. And so we're trying to create those moments that click in cities everywhere.
Yeah, I suppose there just has to be some, like a success or two, you know, in implementing this kind of infrastructure that will create enough excitement and interest in adoption.
Yeah. And, we're hopefully getting there, but Kyle offers that potential. And of course, we've got Lincoln, California, and Peachtree City, Georgia, and Bay Harbor, Michigan, and a couple of others. But we need to replicate this and learn and replicate fast.
Just one last question. We've talked about a lot here already. What have we left out? Are there any other actions you're taking to advance this, the cause?
Oh, well, sure. I'm at work on my next book, and these are very direct how-to. It's tiny transit the number two, and make the economic case for your city. And it's directed at mayors. Let's give them the way to do this. Otherwise, it's going to be talk for years, and we've just got to act. I am kind of like a Janie Appleseed, just going around and dropping the book and calling people up and seeing where I can find interest. And that's where the interest exists. That's where we go. One of my friends says, aren't you afraid someone's going to take this idea and, steal it and run with it? And I just wish it were that simple. Please steal this idea. What we're really trying to do is create a groundswell, a movement where it becomes obvious and evident that we need to do this, and where once you have a demo and you have people in a neighborhood electric vehicle, very small, or bicycles, and they are whizzing right past people stuck in congested cities because we've created a continuous flow network for them, I think that also becomes a moment of change in people's minds. I mean, I mentioned Katie Cam. She has a PhD in civil engineering, and I met her when her professor introduced us because we were working on basically the same idea. And she did a whole doctoral thesis dissertation that found that you can get there faster by going slower. So if you're moving with continuous flow at 25 miles per hour or less, you're actually doing better than people in cars in many cases. Like you said, cities all over the world are congested. We have a public health crisis. The number one cause of injury death at almost every age in the United States is traffic accidents. I have 5 friends who have lost children in car crashes in and around Austin. 2 years ago, and bear in mind, I am the only person I know who has read every single traffic fatality report in Austin since 2008. I read them all because I'm looking for patterns. And I didn't immediately start on tiny transit and lean mobility. I started on trying to reduce traffic deaths. And then I hit upon this as something that not just does that, but opens up a whole economic opportunities and health and all these advantages. But 2 years ago, my son was crossing at 14, crossing Barton Springs Road here in Austin. And he was walking his bike. He got to the median and stopped. And then the next car over caught his eye and motioned him through. And the car in the next lane did not see him and did not slow down and hit him.
Ooh.
And the first car sped away, was never found. The second car stayed. Bystanders pulled him out of the street, and one guy tore off his shirt and wrapped his bloody body in it. And I got a call to meet the police at Dell Children's Hospital immediately. My son had been hit. I can't even tell you what those 20 minutes were like as I fought through traffic to try to get to him. He survived. Had the car been going any faster, he would not have. It's that speed issue again. And I went back, and now he's doing better. He missed school. He had to go to physical therapy. His leg still hurts. And he used to be a runner. He ran everywhere. And now he doesn't run like he did. And we are so lucky. Every day we are grateful that he's alive. But that crosswalk, after he was hit, and I went and met with people about it, and they really want to do the right thing. I know they do, but there's not money to improve it. So they went and repainted the stripes a bit and put up better signs. And I learned that that's called an uncontrolled crosswalk, and it's particularly dangerous. And when we design our cities around cars and are not willing to change and not willing to see that the future is going to be different, then decisions are made to not fix that crosswalk. My son's injuries and hospital bills exceeded what it would have cost to improve that crosswalk. And so we were just way out of alignment. So have always felt compelled to do this for the last several years, but now I have kind of a redoubled energy and a real sense of how wasting time costs lives, and it costs us our future, because we will not be prepared to withstand a recession, and a recession politically could be very disastrous for this country. So I am at my core a believer in the earth, in conservation, and in democracy. And so that's where this comes from for me.
Learn more about Susan's work at tinytransit.com. You can stay in touch with Plutopia at plutopia.io. On Facebook, look for @Plutopia News. On Twitter, it's @Plutopia. With John Lebkowski, I'm Scoop Sweeney. This is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.